I used to believe that blood meant everything. I used to think that family was the one thing in this world you could count on when everything else fell apart. I was so incredibly wrong, and the person who taught me that lesson was the same woman who held me at my mother's funeral and promised she would always be there for me, my Aunt Linda, the woman who smiled at me across Christmas dinner tables, who sent me birthday cards with handwritten notes about how proud she was of me, who called me her second daughter. That same woman systematically tried to destroy my life, steal everything my mother left me, and leave me with nothing but broken dreams and an empty bank account. But she made one critical mistake. She underestimated me. She thought I was still that grieving, naive, 23-year-old girl she first started manipulating 5 years ago. She had no idea that I had been watching, learning, and waiting for the perfect moment to expose every single lie she ever told. This is the story of how my aunt turned into my worst enemy and how I made sure she faced every consequence she deserved. Let me take you back to where it all began, because you need to understand the depth of the betrayal to truly appreciate how far I had to climb to get my justice. My mother, Margaret Matthews, passed away when I was 23 years old. Pancreatic cancer. They found it too late, and she was gone within 4 months of the diagnosis. Those 4 months were the hardest of my entire life. I watched the strongest woman I had ever known become a shadow of herself, and I held her hand as she took her final breath in a hospice in Manchester. My father had never been in the picture. He left when I was 2 years old, and my mother raised me entirely on her own. She worked her way up from a shop assistant to eventually owning her own chain of boutique clothing stores across the north of England. By the time she passed, she had built an empire worth approximately £2.3 million, and she left every penny of it to me. I remember the day of the funeral so clearly. It was raining, because of course it was. England in November doesn't know how to do anything else. I stood at her graveside feeling completely hollow, like someone had reached inside my chest and removed everything that made me who I was. That's when Aunt Linda appeared at my side. She put her arm around my shoulders and pulled me close, and I remember the smell of her perfume, something expensive that always lingered in every room she entered. She whispered in my ear that I wasn't alone, that she would help me through this, that we were family, and family stuck together. I believed her. God. I believed every word. You see, Aunt Linda was my mother's younger sister, and they had always been close. At least that's what I thought. Linda had married well to a man named Jeffrey who worked in finance in London. They lived in a beautiful house in Surrey, drove expensive cars, and took holidays to places I had only ever seen in magazines. But what I didn't know then, what I wouldn't discover until much later, was that Jeffrey's firm had been struggling for years. They were living well beyond their means, drowning in debt, and desperately trying to maintain the illusion of wealth. When my mother died and left me everything, Linda saw an opportunity. She saw a grieving, inexperienced young woman with access to millions, and she saw a way out of her financial nightmare. The first few months after my mother's death were a blur. I was in no state to handle anything, let alone a complicated estate and a chain of businesses I knew nothing about running. That's when Linda stepped in with what seemed like genuine concern. She suggested that I take some time to grieve properly, that I shouldn't rush into any big decisions, and that she would be happy to help manage things temporarily until I was ready. She had some experience with business, she said. Jeffrey could help with the financial side. It would be a family effort to preserve my mother's legacy. I was so grateful. I actually cried when she offered, because I felt so overwhelmed and so alone, and here was someone offering to take some of that weight off my shoulders. The first sign that something was wrong came about 6 months after my mother's funeral. I had been staying at Linda's house in Surrey for a few weeks, trying to get back on my feet and figure out my next steps. I had given her limited power of attorney to handle some of the day-to-day business operations, and I had added her as a signatory on the business account so she could pay suppliers and staff while I was in no condition to do so. One evening, I came downstairs to get a glass of water, and I overheard Linda on the phone in the study. The door was slightly open, and I heard her laugh in a way I had never heard before. It was cold, almost cruel. She said something like, "She has no idea," and then she laughed again. I froze in the hallway, my heart suddenly pounding. I told myself I must have misheard, that she must have been talking about something else entirely. But something shifted in me that night. A tiny seed of doubt was planted, and once it was there, it refused to go away. I started paying more attention after that. I noticed little things that hadn't registered before. The way Linda would change the subject whenever I asked specific questions about the business finances. The way she always seemed to have an excuse for why I shouldn't visit the stores or meet with the accountants. The way Jeffrey would avoid eye contact with me whenever money came up. I tried to dismiss these observations as paranoia, as the product of grief playing tricks on my mind, but the doubts kept growing. About 8 months after my mother's death, I finally felt ready to start taking a more active role in the business. I called Linda and told her I wanted to come down to London to meet with the accountants and review the financial records. There was a pause on the line, just a fraction of a second too long before she responded with forced enthusiasm. "Of course, darling," she said. "That's wonderful news. I'll set everything up." But when I arrived at the accountant's office 3 days later, I was told that Linda had called ahead and postponed the meeting. She said I wasn't feeling well, the accountant explained apologetically. She said you needed to reschedule. I hadn't told Linda I was sick. I wasn't sick. I stood there in the reception area of that office, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. That was the moment I knew something was seriously wrong. I didn't confront her right away. Something told me to be smart about this, to gather information before making any accusations. Instead, I smiled and nodded when Linda called that evening to check on me. Playing along with the story that I had been feeling unwell, I told her I was fine now, just a touch of the flu, and that we could reschedule the accountant meeting for the following week. She seemed relieved, and that relief told me everything I needed to know. She was hiding something, and I was going to find out what. The next few weeks were an education in deception. I learned how to smile while my mind was racing with suspicions. I learned how to ask innocent questions that were actually fishing for information. I learned how to access records that Linda didn't know I could access. My mother, it turned out, had been far more careful than anyone gave her credit for. She had set up a secondary email account for business correspondence, one that she had given me the password to before she died, telling me it was just in case anything ever happened and I needed to know the truth. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. I assumed it was just my mother being her usual cautious self. But when I finally logged into that email account and started reading the messages, my world collapsed. The emails told a story that I couldn't have imagined in my worst nightmares. Linda had been contacting suppliers behind my back, renegotiating contracts and pocketing the difference. She had been diverting funds from the business accounts into a private account in Jeffrey's name. She had been systematically stripping the company of its assets, selling off valuable inventory and property without my knowledge or consent. Over the 8 months since my mother's death, she had stolen nearly £400,000, and she wasn't done. The most recent emails discussed plans to convince me to sell the entire business, with Linda acting as the broker, taking a massive commission while steering the sale to a buyer who would pay well below market value. A buyer who, as I discovered with growing horror, was a shell company owned by Jeffrey. I sat at my laptop in my tiny rented flat in Manchester, reading these emails with tears streaming down my face. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that I could barely breathe. This was my mother's sister. This was the woman who had held me at the funeral and promised to protect me. This was the woman who called me darling and told me she loved me like her own daughter, and she had been stealing from me from the very beginning. She had looked into my grieving eyes and seen nothing but an opportunity. She had used my trust, my pain, and my inexperience against me, and she had done it all with a smile on her face. I wanted to scream. I wanted to call her immediately and unleash every bit of rage and pain I was feeling, but something stopped me. Maybe it was my mother's voice in my head, the woman who had built an empire through patience and strategy. Maybe it was simple survival instinct, but I knew that if I confronted Linda now, I would lose. She would deny everything. She would make me look like the crazy, paranoid niece who couldn't handle her grief. She would turn the rest of the family against me, and worst of all, she might cover her tracks so effectively that I could never prove what she had done. No, I needed a plan. I needed evidence. I needed to be smarter than she was. That night, I made 2 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to David Chen, my childhood friend who had grown up down the street from me in Manchester. David was a lawyer now, working at a small but respected firm in the city. We had drifted apart over the years. but he had come to my mother's funeral and left his card with me, telling me to call if I ever needed anything. I called him that night and told him everything. There was a long silence on the other end of the line when I finished. Then he said something I will never forget. He said, "Sophie, we're going to get her, but we have to do this right. We have to be patient." I agreed, even though patience was the last thing I felt capable of. The second call was to my grandfather, Richard Matthews. He was my mother's father, a retired businessman who had made his fortune in manufacturing decades ago. He was 78 years old and lived in a large house in the Cotswolds, mostly keeping to himself since my grandmother passed. I hadn't spoken to him much since my mother's funeral, partly because I had been drowning in grief, and partly because Linda had subtly discouraged contact, always mentioning that grandfather was fragile and shouldn't be worried with family drama. But I called him anyway, and when I told him what I had discovered, his response surprised me. He didn't sound shocked, he sounded sad, almost resigned. He told me that he had suspected something was wrong for months, but hadn't wanted to believe it. He told me things about Linda that I had never known, things that my mother had apparently protected me from my entire life. It turned out that Linda had always been jealous of my mother, always. From the time they were children, Linda had resented her older sister's success, her beauty, her easy way with people. When my mother started her business and became wealthy, that jealousy turned into something darker. Linda had tried to borrow money from my mother multiple times over the years, always with elaborate excuses and promises to repay. My mother had helped her at first, but when she realized that Linda was lying about what the money was for, she cut her off. That's when their relationship changed. They still saw each other at family events, still maintained the appearance of closeness. But my mother never fully trusted Linda again. She had told our grandfather this in confidence, made him promise not to tell me because she didn't want to burden me with family drama. She thought she was protecting me. She had no idea that her silence would leave me vulnerable to the very person she had been protecting me from. Grandfather told me he would support me in whatever I decided to do. He told me he had connections, resources, and most importantly, knowledge of where all the family secrets were buried. He also told me something that would prove crucial in the months to come. He told me that when my mother was first diagnosed with cancer, before anyone else knew, she had come to him for advice about her estate. She had been worried about what would happen to me if she died, worried about how vulnerable I would be. Together, they had set up certain safeguards, certain provisions that only I would be able to access if I ever found myself in trouble. She had known, my mother had known, that something like this might happen. She had tried to prepare me even from beyond the grave. After those 2 phone calls, I didn't sleep at all. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with plans and possibilities. By the time the sun came up, I had the outline of what I was going to do. It would take time. It would take patience. It would require me to become someone I had never been before. Someone calculating and strategic and cold. But I would do it. For my mother. For myself. For every lie Linda had ever told me. I would expose her, destroy her reputation, and take back everything she had stolen. And by the time I was finished, she would know exactly what it felt like to lose everything. The first phase of my plan was simple but essential. I needed to pretend that nothing had changed. I needed to keep Linda believing that I was still her naive, trusting victim while I gathered evidence and built my case. This was harder than you might imagine. Every time I saw her face, every time she hugged me and called me darling, I wanted to scream the truth in her face. But I smiled. I nodded. I played the part of the grateful niece who had no idea what was happening behind her back. And all the while I was watching, recording, documenting everything. David helped me navigate the legal complexities. We discovered that some of what Linda had done was clearly criminal, theft, fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, but other aspects were more complicated. She had been clever, always staying just within the gray areas of the law, always making sure she had plausible explanations for her actions. To build a truly solid case, we needed more than just emails and financial records. We needed her to admit what she had done. We needed her to implicate herself in a way that couldn't be denied or explained away. This is where my grandfather came in. He had an idea, one that was risky but potentially brilliant. He suggested that we create a scenario so tempting that Linda wouldn't be able to resist. He would pretend to be dying. He would announce that he was revising his will and planning to distribute his considerable fortune among his family. And he would make it clear that the distribution would favor those who had been most supportive to me in my time of grief. The trap was set. If Linda's greed was as powerful as we suspected, she would rush to position herself as my greatest ally, my most devoted supporter, and in doing so, she would reveal her true colors. The plan went into motion 3 months after I discovered the emails. Grandfather called a family meeting at his home in the Cotswolds, announcing that he had received troubling news from his doctor and needed to discuss the future of his estate. Linda was there within 24 hours, practically breaking speed limits to get to his bedside. I watched her performance with a mixture of disgust and dark fascination. She was perfect, the devoted daughter, the caring sister, the wonderful aunt who had sacrificed so much to help her poor orphaned niece. She held my grandfather's hand and cried actual tears. She spoke about family legacy and love and unity. And when grandfather mentioned that he wanted to make sure I was well taken care of, that the bulk of his estate would go to me since I had suffered so much loss already, I saw something flash behind Linda's eyes. It was only there for a second, but I recognized it immediately. Pure, undiluted rage. Over the following weeks, Linda became my best friend. She called me constantly, sent me gifts, invited me to lunch, told me repeatedly how much she loved me. She was laying groundwork, I realized. She was positioning herself so that when grandfather died, she would be so embedded in my life that she could continue her manipulation indefinitely. What she didn't know was that I was recording every conversation. I had installed an app on my phone that automatically recorded all calls. I kept meticulous notes of every meeting, every meal, every gift, and I started asking questions, innocent-sounding questions, about the business finances, questions designed to trap her into lying on record. The break came during a lunch at a fancy restaurant in London. Linda had been drinking, more than usual, celebrating some good news about Jeffrey's business that I suspected was entirely fictional. Her guard was down, and I decided to push a little harder than I had before. I mentioned casually that I had been thinking about getting an independent audit of the business finances, just for peace of mind. I said it lightly, as if it was barely important, but I watched her face carefully as I spoke. The color drained from her cheeks. She laughed too loudly and said that was completely unnecessary, that she had everything under control, that an audit would be a waste of money and would upset the staff. I pushed further. I said that my grandfather had suggested it, that he thought it might be a good learning experience for me to see how businesses were evaluated, and then Linda said something that sealed her fate. She leaned across the table, lowered her voice, and said, "Sophie, darling, you need to trust me. I've been handling certain things in ways that might look irregular to outsiders, but it's all for your benefit. An audit would only cause confusion. Let me deal with the financial side. You just focus on healing and moving forward." I had it. I had her on tape admitting that there were irregularities, admitting that she didn't want outside scrutiny. It wasn't a full confession, not yet, but it was enough to start building a real case. That night, I met with David, and we began the formal process of gathering evidence for a civil lawsuit. We hired a forensic accountant, someone recommended by my grandfather, to do exactly the audit that Linda had been so afraid of. And what we found was even worse than I had imagined. The forensic accountant's report arrived 6 weeks later, and it read like a horror novel. Linda hadn't just stolen £400,000. Over the 8 months of her management, she had systematically looted the business of nearly £800,000. She had done it through fake suppliers, inflated invoices, unauthorized property sales, and straight-up embezzlement. She had been clever enough to cover her tracks in ways that made casual detection nearly impossible, but under professional scrutiny, the web of lies fell apart completely. The accountant also discovered something else, something that made my blood run cold. Linda had been in the process of obtaining a second mortgage on my mother's house, the house I had grown up in, the house that was supposed to be mine. She had forged my signature on the preliminary documents. If we hadn't caught her when we did, she would have stolen the very last piece of my mother I had left. Armed with the forensic report and my recordings, David and I went to the police. I had agonized over this decision for weeks. Part of me wanted to handle everything privately to avoid the family scandal and the public humiliation. But David convinced me that Linda needed to face real consequences, not just financial ones. She had committed crimes, she had forged documents, she had stolen from her own niece while pretending to care for her. She deserved to answer for all of it. The police took my statement and opened a formal investigation. They told me it would take time, that cases like this were complicated, but they assured me they took fraud seriously. I left the station feeling something I hadn't felt in over a year. Hope. But Linda wasn't done yet. She must have sensed that something was wrong because she showed up at my flat in Manchester 2 days after I filed the police report. She was furious, all pretense of the loving aunt stripped away. She accused me of being ungrateful, paranoid, mentally unstable. She said I was going to destroy the family with my accusations. She said my mother would be ashamed of me. That last comment, that one about my mother, almost broke me. I felt tears spring to my eyes, and for a moment, I doubted everything. But then I looked at her face, really looked at it, and I saw nothing but fear and desperation. She was scared. She knew I was onto her, and instead of making me feel guilty, that gave me strength. I kept my voice calm when I responded. I told her that I knew everything. I told her about the emails, the forensic audit, the police report. I told her that I had recordings of our conversations. I watched the color drain from her face, watched the bravado crumble, watched her realize that she had lost. And then I told her to leave my flat and never contact me again. She tried to argue, tried to threaten, tried to bargain. She offered to pay back some of the money. She begged me to think about what this would do to the family. She even tried to blame Jeffrey, saying he had forced her into it, that she was a victim too. But I was done listening to her lies. I opened the door and pointed to the hallway. She left without another word. The months that followed were a strange mixture of triumph and trauma. The police investigation proceeded slowly but steadily. David and I filed a civil lawsuit to recover the stolen funds, and the family predictably fractured. Some relatives sided with me, horrified by what Linda had done. Others sided with her, unable to believe that she was capable of such betrayal. My grandfather stood firmly by my side, his health actually deteriorating during this period, making his earlier pretense of illness feel uncomfortably prophetic. He died 8 months after the family meeting, peacefully in his sleep, with me holding his hand. His will left the majority of his estate to me, just as he had promised. Linda wasn't mentioned at all. I wish I could say that Linda's downfall was swift and satisfying, like something from a movie, but real life isn't like that. The legal process dragged on for almost 2 years. There were delays, complications, moments when I thought the whole thing would fall apart. Linda hired expensive lawyers who tried every trick in the book to discredit me, to dismiss the evidence, to paint me as a troubled young woman who was misinterpreting innocent business transactions. But in the end, the truth was too overwhelming to ignore. The forensic evidence was irrefutable. The recordings spoke for themselves, and Linda's own arrogance had led her to leave a trail of evidence that not even the best lawyers could explain away. The criminal trial took place 3 years after my mother's death. I sat in the courtroom and watched Linda take the stand, watched her lie and deflect and cry on cue, but the jury saw through her. They saw the documents she had forged. They heard the recordings of her admitting to irregularities. They reviewed the financial evidence showing exactly where the money had gone, and after 3 days of deliberation, they found her guilty. Guilty of fraud, guilty of embezzlement, guilty of forgery, guilty of theft. She was sentenced to 4 years in prison. I remember the moment the verdict was read. I expected to feel joy, or at least relief, but instead I felt hollow. I had spent 3 years of my life fighting for this moment, and now that it was here, I realized that it wouldn't bring my mother back. It wouldn't erase the trauma of the betrayal. It wouldn't restore the trust I had lost in family, in people, in the basic goodness of the world. But it was justice. It was accountability. And as I watched Linda being led away in handcuffs, her expensive clothes wrinkled and her perfect makeup smeared with tears, I knew that I had done what needed to be done. The civil case was settled shortly after the criminal verdict. Jeffrey, facing financial ruin and divorce, agreed to a settlement that returned most of the stolen funds. The house my mother had left me was saved. The business, though damaged, was still viable. I took over management myself, learning everything I needed to know through sheer determination and the help of loyal employees who had worked for my mother for years. Within 2 years, I had rebuilt what Linda had tried to destroy. The stores were profitable again. The brand my mother had created was stronger than ever, and I had transformed from a naive, grieving girl into a woman who knew her own worth. But here's the thing about revenge, the thing nobody tells you. It doesn't end when the courtroom goes quiet and the guilty verdict is read. It doesn't end when the stolen money is returned or the business is rebuilt. It lingers, like smoke after a fire, affecting everything it touches. I had won. I had beaten Linda at her own game, exposed her lies, and watched her face consequences I had once only dreamed about. But I was also changed. I was harder, more suspicious, less willing to trust. The innocence I had before my mother's death, before Linda's betrayal, was gone forever. Some nights I wondered if the cost had been worth it. Most nights I knew it had. Part 2. 4 years passed after Linda's sentencing. 4 years during which I built a life I could be proud of. The business thrived. I moved into my mother's house, finally making it my own while honoring her memory. I dated occasionally, though I struggled to let anyone get too close. The scars from Linda's betrayal had healed, but they had left marks that anyone who got near me eventually noticed. Trust didn't come easily anymore. I had learned too well how easily it could be weaponized. And then, on a gray February afternoon, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. A prison number. Linda was calling to tell me she was getting out. Early release for good behavior. She would be free in 3 weeks. I hung up without saying a word. But that night, I couldn't sleep. The fear came rushing back. The anxiety, the hypervigilance. 4 years of healing felt like they evaporated in seconds. I called David, waking him at 2 in the morning, unable to control the panic in my voice. He talked me down, reminded me of everything we had accomplished, assured me that Linda had no power over me anymore. But even as he spoke, I knew that I was going to have to face her again. Our story wasn't finished. She wouldn't let it be. I was right. Linda was released on a Tuesday morning in March, and by Friday, she was making her presence known. She didn't contact me directly, not at first. She was smarter than that. Instead, she reached out to extended family members, the ones who had stayed neutral during the trial. She told them she had changed, that prison had given her time to reflect, that she wanted to make amends. She told them she was writing a book about her experiences, about how she had been wrongly convicted, about how I had manipulated the evidence and ruined her life. She was rewriting history. And some people, incredibly, were believing her. The first time I heard about the book, I laughed. The idea was so absurd, so blatantly self-serving, that I couldn't take it seriously. But then I started seeing mentions of it online. Linda had connections in the media world through Jeffrey's old business associates, and she was using them to generate interest. She pitched herself as a victim of a family feud, a misunderstood woman who had been caught up in complicated business dealings and thrown in prison by a vindictive niece. The narrative was so twisted that it made my head spin, but I was terrified to realize that it was gaining traction. David warned me not to engage. He said that responding would only give Linda's story more attention, more legitimacy. He reminded me that I had the truth on my side, that the court records were public, that anyone who actually looked at the evidence would see through her lies. But I couldn't just sit there and watch her rewrite the story of what she had done to me. I couldn't let her turn my mother's legacy, my inheritance, my trauma into content for her redemption narrative. I had to do something. The opportunity came from an unexpected source. A journalist named Priya Sharma reached out to me through my business website. She was working on an investigative piece about wealthy criminals who used their connections to rehabilitate their images after prison. She had heard about Linda's book deal and wanted to know if I would be willing to share my side of the story. I agreed to meet her, though I was nervous. My experience with Linda had taught me that not everyone who seemed helpful actually was, but something about Priya felt genuine. She was thorough, professional, and most importantly, she had already done her homework. She had read the court documents. She knew exactly what Linda had done, and she was determined to make sure the public knew too. Our first meeting was at a coffee shop in Manchester. Priya was a small woman with sharp eyes and a quick smile. She ordered a flat white and pulled out a voice recorder, asking my permission before turning it on. I told her everything, starting from my mother's funeral and ending with Linda's phone call from prison. It took almost 3 hours, and by the end, I was emotionally exhausted. But I also felt lighter than I had in weeks. There was power in telling the truth, in knowing that it would reach people who might otherwise be fooled by Linda's lies. Priya's article was published 6 weeks later in a major national newspaper. It was devastating. She had not only included my story, but had tracked down former employees of my mother's business, people who had witnessed Linda's behavior firsthand and had been waiting years for someone to ask them about it. She had obtained statements from the forensic accountant, from the police officers who had led the investigation, from the prosecutor who had tried the case. And she had confronted Linda directly, presenting her with specific pieces of evidence and recording her increasingly desperate attempts to explain them away. By the time the article went viral, Linda's book deal had been canceled. Her media connections had abandoned her, and the public narrative had shifted decisively in my favor. But Linda wasn't finished. She never would be, I realized. She was incapable of admitting defeat, incapable of accepting responsibility for what she had done. Instead of retreating quietly, she doubled down. She started a blog, posting long rants about how I had conspired with the media to destroy her. She showed up at family events uninvited, causing scenes and making accusations. She filed frivolous lawsuits, each one dismissed, but each one requiring time and money to deal with. She was like a wasp trapped in a jar, stinging everything she could reach even though it was hopeless. The harassment escalated slowly, so gradually that I almost didn't notice at first. Hang-up calls at all hours of the night, mysterious packages delivered to my house. My car tires slashed twice in 1 month. I couldn't prove it was Linda, not directly, but I knew. David helped me get a restraining order, which Linda promptly violated. She was arrested again, this time for stalking and harassment. She spent another 6 months in prison, and when she got out, she was finally, truly broken. I saw her one last time, about a year after her second release. I was coming out of a restaurant in London with some colleagues from the business, and she was sitting on a bench across the street. She looked terrible, 20 years older than her actual age, dressed in clothes that were dirty and worn. Our eyes met, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Then she stood up and walked toward me. My colleagues tensed, ready to intervene, but I held up my hand. I needed to hear what she had to say. She stopped a few feet away, close enough that I could see the lines etched deep in her face, the gray in her hair, the emptiness in her eyes. She didn't look like the polished, confident woman who had stood beside me at my mother's funeral. She looked like someone who had lost everything and knew it. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. She said she was sorry. She said she had been wrong. She said she had destroyed her own life chasing money that was never hers to take. And then she said something that surprised me. She said my mother had been right to cut her off all those years ago. She said my mother had seen something in her that she hadn't been willing to admit to herself. And she said she wished she had listened. I don't know if she meant it. I don't know if she was capable of genuine remorse, or if this was just another manipulation, another attempt to get something from me. But standing there on that London street, looking at the wreckage of the woman who had once tried to steal everything from me, I felt something unexpected. Not forgiveness, exactly, but something close to it. A release, a recognition that her story was no longer connected to mine. She had made her choices, faced her consequences, and now she would live with the results. And I would move on, finally, completely, into the life my mother had wanted for me. I didn't respond to her apology. I just nodded once, turned around, and walked away. I never saw her again. I heard later that she had moved to Spain, living off whatever remained of Jeffrey's assets after the divorce and the legal fees. I heard she was sick, some kind of chronic condition exacerbated by stress and poor living conditions. I heard she was alone, abandoned by the society friends who had once admired her, forgotten by the family members who had once defended her. I felt nothing when I heard these things. The rage was gone. The need for revenge was satisfied. There was only acceptance of what had been and what was. The years that followed were the best of my life. The business expanded, opening new stores across the UK and eventually into Europe. I met someone, a woman named Rachel, who was patient enough to wait while I learned to trust again. We got married 3 years after our first date, in a small ceremony held in the garden of my mother's house. I wore a dress I had designed myself, using the last piece of fabric my mother had ever purchased for the business. I like to think she would have approved. I'm 37 years old now, writing this from the office of the company my mother built and I rebuilt. There's a photo of her on my desk taken during a business trip to Paris, the last trip we took together before she was diagnosed. She's laughing at something off camera, and every time I look at it, I remember how much joy she brought into my life. I think about her every day. I think about what she taught me, about resilience and patience, and the importance of protecting yourself without losing your soul. I think about how she tried to warn me about Linda, even from beyond the grave, how she set up those safeguards and that secret email account because she knew her sister better than anyone. And I think about Linda sometimes, too. Not with anger anymore, not with the burning need for vengeance that consumed me for so many years, just with a kind of distant sadness. She could have been part of my life. She could have been the aunt who helped me through my grief, who watched me build my career, who came to my wedding and celebrated my successes. Instead, she chose greed. She chose betrayal. She chose to see me as a target rather than a niece. And in making that choice, she lost everything that actually mattered. I get messages sometimes from people who have gone through similar experiences. They find me through the business website or through social media, and they reach out because they're in the middle of their own battles with family members who have betrayed them. They ask for advice, for hope, for reassurance that things will get better. I always respond. I tell them the truth, that it's going to be hard, harder than they can imagine. I tell them they're going to doubt themselves, going to wonder if they're overreacting, going to want to give up. But I also tell them that justice is possible, that the truth has a way of coming out, even when it takes years, that they are stronger than they know, capable of surviving things that seem impossible right now. And I tell them that the best revenge isn't destruction. The best revenge is living a life so good, so full, so abundant, that the person who tried to break you has to watch from a distance and know they failed. That's what I did. That's what Linda has to live with now. Every success I have, every milestone I reach, every moment of happiness I experience is a reminder to her of what she gave up. She chose money over family. She chose short-term gain over long-term love. And now she's alone, sick, forgotten, while I'm surrounded by people who love me, running a thriving business, living in the home where I grew up. That's justice, not the prison sentence, though that was necessary. Not the financial ruin, though that was deserved. The real justice is that I won. I built the life she tried to steal from me, and I built it better than she ever could have imagined. I want to end by talking about forgiveness, because it's something I struggled with for years. After everything Linda did, after the theft and the lies and the harassment, people sometimes asked me if I had forgiven her. For a long time, my answer was an emphatic no. How could I forgive someone who had looked into my grieving eyes and seen nothing but an opportunity? How could I forgive someone who had stolen from me while pretending to care about me? How could I forgive someone who had tried to take the last pieces of my mother I had left? But over time, my understanding of forgiveness changed. I realized that forgiveness isn't about excusing what someone did. It isn't about saying that their actions were acceptable or that you're willing to let them back into your life. Forgiveness is about releasing the hold that their actions have on you. It's about saying, I refuse to let what you did define my future. I refuse to carry this weight anymore. It's about freedom, not absolution. In that sense, yes, I forgave Linda. Not for her sake, but for mine. I forgave her so that I could sleep peacefully at night, so that I could trust my wife without reservation, so that I could build a future that wasn't shadowed by the past. I forgave her so that she could stop taking up space in my head, space that belonged to people and things that actually mattered, and in doing so, I finally understood what my mother had known all along. The best way to defeat someone who tries to destroy you isn't to become like them. It's to become so fully yourself that their attempts to diminish you only highlight how small they really are. My mother's legacy lives on. The business she started with nothing but determination and vision now employs over 200 people. The stores she opened in small northern towns have expanded into a national brand, and the lessons she taught me about hard work and integrity and the importance of protecting yourself have guided me through every challenge I've faced. She would be proud, I think. Proud of what I've built, proud of how I handled Linda, proud of the woman I've become. As for Linda, I hear she's still in Spain, still alone, still facing the consequences of choices she made decades ago. I don't wish her ill anymore. I don't wish her anything. She's simply irrelevant, a chapter of my life that's been written and closed. She was my aunt once, she became my enemy, and now she's nothing at all. This is the truth of betrayal that nobody tells you. It doesn't just happen and then end. It echoes through years, through relationships, through your understanding of who you are and what you're capable of surviving. But if you're strong enough, if you're patient enough, if you're willing to fight for yourself even when it seems hopeless, you can turn that betrayal into something else. You can turn it into fuel, into motivation, into the foundation of a life so extraordinary that the person who tried to break you can't even comprehend it. I was 23 when my mother died, and Linda began her betrayal. I'm 37 now, 14 years removed from the worst moment of my life. And in those 14 years, I've learned more about strength, resilience, and justice than most people learn in a lifetime. I've learned that the people who are supposed to protect you sometimes become your greatest threats. I've learned that trust, once broken, takes years to rebuild. I've learned that revenge, real revenge, isn't about destruction. It's about survival. It's about thriving in spite of everything that's been done to you. It's about looking at the person who tried to take everything from you and saying, "You failed. I'm still here, and I'm stronger than ever." My name is Sophie Matthews. My aunt turned into my enemy. She stole from me, lied to me, tried to destroy everything my mother had built. But she didn't win. I did. And every morning, when I wake up in the house where I grew up, when I walk into the office of the company my mother started, when I look at my wife and know that I've finally learned to trust again, I'm reminded that the best revenge isn't about making someone else suffer. It's about making yourself whole. It's about taking the broken pieces of what they left behind and building something beautiful. It's about proving every single day that their cruelty wasn't strong enough to break you. Linda thought she was smarter than me. She thought my grief made me weak. She thought she could take what she wanted and I would never know, never fight back, never hold her accountable. She was wrong about everything, and now she has the rest of her life to live with that knowledge. That's justice. That's karma. That's the truth being revealed and the consequences finally arriving. That's the story of how my aunt became my enemy and how I made sure she lost everything she ever cared about. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it helps someone out there who's going through something similar. I hope it reminds you that you're not alone, that betrayal can be survived, that justice is possible even when it seems impossible. And I hope, most of all, that it gives you the courage to fight for yourself, because you deserve it. You deserve to win. And someday, when you look back on everything you've been through, you'll realize that you're stronger than you ever knew. That's the gift hidden inside betrayal. It teaches you exactly what you're made of. And once you know that, nobody can ever take it away from you again.